The sanctions, a tool of deterrence that so clearly failed, now must become a tool of punishment.
We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself. Cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen.
The subtext here was clear. The invasion has happened. It couldn't be stopped. It can't be stopped. Now is about cutting Russia off.
In this crisis, Ukraine is the biggest loser. The talk of war was already costing Ukraine's economy $3 billion a month, according to reports, since the beginning of the crisis. As for Russia, it's a top oil and natural gas producer. The most effective way to target Russia with sanctions is to cut off its supply of oil and natural gas to the West. It could mean higher energy costs for both America and Europe. Currently, oil prices surged past $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. And even Russia does not want oil to get pricier. Russia's inflation is currently at 8%. A further increase in the price of oil will push up prices in other sectors. As for the rest of the world, it means more disruptions, more supply chain problems, more market volatility, and more oil price hikes. Russia is a major exporter of rare earth minerals. These are used in airplanes, converters. Ukraine is a major source of neon used in making semiconductors. Both countries also produce major quantities of fertilizers.
We've just been hearing about the sanctions that are coming Russia's way and could be coming Russia's way. Has Moscow been preparing for a moment like this?
Yes, they have. Part of the problem here is that this was first dangled as an option, this idea that Russia could be kicked out of the SWIFT banking system back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. So at the time, Russia responded in a typically bombastic fashion, saying that kicking it out of the SWIFT system would be the equivalent of a declaration of war. So at the time, Western allies put it on the back burner. That was in 2014, over 7 years ago. Russia has had time to build up what many are calling a fortress economy. They've de-dollarized massively. They've built up gold reserves and $643 billion in currency reserves, and they have one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the entire world. So these are all a result of a careful plan that President Putin has been putting in place since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. There are some fears being floated around that if Russia is kicked out, it would undermine the SWIFT system as a whole and encourage the development of alternatives. Russia does have its own system, SPFS, but currently it's really only used by Russian banks. China launched its own system in 2015, but that's really still under development. It's called the Cross-Border International Payment System, and it's only used by about 80 foreign banks. But in principle, there's no reason it can't be used as a substitute for SWIFT.
Fertilizer markets, which are tied to natural gas, and are up quite a bit year on year already. Some of this pullback in price you're seeing is after a record rally over the past year and a half, not just in the last sort of week or two, right? So I think from a fundamental standpoint, if you look at wheat, we're at all-time, essentially from a stock standpoint at lows of over a decade in terms of stockpiles. So sensitive times. So if you look at where most Russian and Ukrainian wheat goes today, it's to the Middle East. Middle East is one of the largest buyers. Middle East and Northern Africa are one of the largest buyers of wheat from that region. And the Middle East and North Africa are experiencing droughts that are sort of at their worst levels in over 20 years, according to our drought index. And so, it's going to need a home. There's demand for it. Supply and demand balances, markets are tight. And so really, what are we, where does this go will be a question asked. Let's not also forget that China did remove its import ban on Russian wheat. So that's another sort of new home for these grains.
Russia supplies almost about 1/3 of Europe's natural gas. The gas goes to serve the same nations who are now confronting Russia over Ukraine. Russia is to natural gas what Saudi Arabia is to oil. Russia sits on nearly about $630 billion of reserves. For decades, gas and oil have been the centerpiece of the Soviet and now the Russian economy. With 32% of established world reserves, Russia outranks Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Russia's gas company Gazprom single-handedly holds a quarter of all world's gas reserves. It also controls almost about 90% of the Russian output. Russia is also dependent on the European markets as well. Energy accounts for about half of Russia's export earnings. If the US further sanctions Russia, then the flow of natural gas could of course be a bit of a collateral damage. The American president has particularly mentioned that the actions to punish Russia's economy are not intended to hit the global energy markets. So oil and gas flows will not be targeted, which means that Russia will of course continue to make millions per day selling cheap gas to Europe. And although Europe has been making a lot of noises showing its solidarity for the people in Ukraine, it will not stop purchasing cheap gas from Russia.
But what of sanctions against the man who ordered the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin? For Brussels, it is not as simple as freezing Putin's assets, estimated at several billion euros. The most extreme sanctions will in fact affect the Russian state over any individuals. Sanctions will hit the commercial sector, with technology no longer being sold to Russia. The same goes for new airplanes and aeronautic equipment.
The sanctions will not have a very important impact on the Russian economy, in any case much less than what the West would like, because Russia has been anticipating them for years. Russia understood that no matter what, it had to try to protect its financial sector, its economy, as much as possible from new sanctions in the years to come.
Vladimir Putin has spent years preparing for this eventuality. Russia has built up its financial reserves to over $600 billion. Another ace up the Russian sleeve. Between themselves and Ukraine, they produce nearly a quarter of the world's wheat supply. The invasion has led to fears of a global supply shortage.
Ukraine is one of the most important agricultural producers in the world. Ukraine is the third largest wheat or corn exporter in the world and the fifth largest wheat exporter. And their wheat especially goes to a lot of lower and middle income countries around the world, and especially in the Middle East. While bread prices make it sort of the bulk of the sort of focus, meat prices and prices of other sort of agricultural products that depend on those commodity crops for production are going to be impacted. And going back to Arab Spring, I think it's a fairly sort of common assertion that bread prices and price of general food was a main driver of the sort of political instability and uprisings at that time. So you could see political instability, you could see food insecurity, and in the worst case, hunger and human suffering.
First, we commit to ensuring that a certain number of Russian banks are removed from SWIFT. This will ensure that these banks are disconnected from the international financial system and harm their ability to operate globally.
Called the nuclear option of sanctions, Western allies have banned several Russian banks from SWIFT in response to its invasion of Ukraine. As the world's top payment transfer network, SWIFT is seen as essential plumbing for the world's banks. The Belgian-based service connects some 11,000 lenders around the world, facilitating more than 40 million transactions a day. The ban is expected to have a devastating effect on Russia's economy. Cross-border transactions will become much more difficult and expensive for financial institutions there and could cripple Russian trade. The cutoff could deal a major blow to some economies of EU member states, both in receiving payments on Russian debt and in paying for the Russian gas it relies on. Russia has been trying to cushion the blow of a SWIFT ban by turning to alternatives.
Russia is developing its own sort of parallel system to SWIFT. And of course, if you take Russia out of the SWIFT system, it will simply seek to develop its own system along with China and become a competitor to SWIFT.
Russian oil and gas have not been sanctioned. Does that make a difference?
Well, Russia is too big to sanction. The global market cannot survive without Russian oil, and certainly Europe cannot survive without Russian gas. So in every other area, Russia can be sanctioned. But when it comes to energy, it cannot be sanctioned.
But Mr. Fishikar, you say that Russia's too big to sanction, but over the weekend, the West has proven that they're actually ready to take the pain to make sure that they're sanctioned appropriately, including freezing the Russian central bank. How will Putin likely react, and what's the pain threshold that actually Western countries can deal? If oil goes to 150, I mean, they have the central banks to step in and support it.
Well, the supply and demand for oil, the Russian oil is flowing. Euros is coming to, a lot of it is coming to Europe. A lot of the banks are worried about issuing letters of credit. It is discounted in the market, but is entering the market. And the payment will take place. The Russian gas, without Russian gas, Europe cannot survive. No question about it. There is no alternative to Russia when it comes to natural gas in Europe. These things to be fixed, it takes a decade. It's not something which can be fixed by actions of the different governments. The US government says this, or the Qatari government says that. It has to be done on a long-term basis. For the time being, you cannot sanction Russian oil and gas business. The world needs it, and without it, there would be an incredible crisis. Much bigger crisis, economic crisis, than anybody can anticipate.
The United States and the European nations have now interestingly chosen to banish certain big Russian banks from the main global payment system called SWIFT. The move appears to be dealing a pretty severe economic blow for the Russian economy. The worried Muscovites fear that the new Western sanctions will trigger shortages of cash and will disrupt even the otherwise normal payment systems that they used. Russians were seen waiting early this morning outside of ATMs in very long queues, and there are concerns that bank cards, that is your debit and your credit cards, could also cease to function.
Are having the ruble is plummeting, first of all. What does that mean for the Russian economy?
Well, it's a disaster in many ways. The pictures we've just seen of these queues outside banks tell us so much. If you imagine that you're a Russian saver, an ordinary Russian who's got all their savings in rubles, they're worth 30% less today than they were yesterday. It's 119 rubles to the dollar now. So in that case, it's a very, very serious problem. And, often when we're talking about, the political and the economic where they overlap, I think it's always with sort of things like currency values that you really see the political impact, the possible political impact of this, because it's so strong. Prices will rise because it will force inflation, because a lot of the economy relies on imports, which will now cost more because the ruble is worth less. So in these areas, you can sort of see that it's going to have massive impact.
Of course, the sanctions directly against the Russian central bank, that effectively freezes any assets here in the United States. Basically, they're not going anywhere until the U.S. says they are. Of course, you got sanctions out of the U.K. I thought some of the more significant sanctions, though, were out of EU, even though they were effectively the same as the U.S. The fact that now you're seeing the European nations more united here in pushing back, not only the ban on Russian transactions out of the central bank there, but of course, you talk about the closing of EU airspace, which is huge here. And then there are a lot of other things, that crackdown some of the state-owned media companies. You wonder sort of what the broader effect is, not only on the economic issues with regards to Russia, but whether it actually has a political ramification for Putin, where he would change.
Уважаемые коллеги, вы видите, что западные страны предпринимают не только недружественные действия в отношении нашей страны в экономической сфере, я имею в виду нелегитимные санкции, о которых все хорошо знают, но высшие должностные лица ведущих стран НАТО допускают и агрессивные высказывания в адрес нашей страны. Поэтому приказываю министру обороны и начальнику генерального штаба перевести силы сдерживания российской армии в особый режим несения боевого дежурства.